In the early 20th century, in the heart of Tulsa, Oklahoma, there stood a place that defied everything America believed was possible for black citizens at the time. It was called the Greenwood District, better known as Black Wall Street. Street after street was filled with black-owned banks, theaters, newspapers, restaurants, medical offices, and luxury shops. Families owned their homes. Children walked to well-funded schools. Money circulated within the community, creating generational stability and pride. Greenwood was not just surviving, it was thriving. At a time when segregation laws were designed to limit opportunity, Greenwood became a powerful symbol of independence, intelligence, and economic success. It represented what could happen when a community was forced to rely on itself and succeeded beyond expectations. For many black Americans across the country, Black Wall Street was proof that prosperity was possible, even in a system stacked against them. But this success did not exist in isolation. Outside Greenwood's borders, resentment quietly grew. Economic envy, racial fear, and long-standing prejudice simmered beneath the surface of a divided city. What happened next would not only destroy a community in a matter of hours, but would also be buried, denied, and erased from history for decades. This is not just a story about the past. It is a story about truth, silence, and what happens when progress challenges power. It is about a community that built something extraordinary and the forces that moved to tear it down. Before we go deeper into this untold chapter of American history, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. By doing so, you help ensure that stories like this are not forgotten again. Let's uncover what really happened and why it still matters today. Greenwood did not rise by accident, nor was its success the result of special treatment or hidden advantages. It was born out of separation. Segregation laws in early 20th century Tulsa were designed to restrict where black residents could live, work, and spend their money, forcing them into clearly defined boundaries. Yet within those limits, Greenwood became something unexpected. Because black citizens were excluded from white-owned businesses and institutions, they built their own. Doctors treated their neighbors, lawyers defended their community, shop owners reinvested their profits locally, and families supported one another in ways that strengthened every block. What was meant to confine them instead created an ecosystem of self-reliance and shared purpose. As Greenwood grew, its success became impossible to ignore. Brick buildings replaced wooden storefronts. Well-dressed customers filled the streets, and businesses continued to expand even as other parts of the city struggled. In the aftermath of World War I, many white Tulsans faced rising unemployment, inflation, and economic uncertainty. Jobs were scarce, wages were unstable, and the promises of post-war prosperity felt increasingly out of reach. Against this backdrop, Greenwood stood as a visible contradiction to the idea that black communities were destined to remain poor and dependent. To some, it was inspiring. To others, it was deeply unsettling. The resentment did not emerge overnight. It built slowly, fed by rumors, stereotypes, and long-standing racial narratives that framed black progress as a threat rather than a success. Greenwood's independence challenged the social order that placed power and wealth firmly in white hands. The sight of black-owned banks, elegant homes, and thriving enterprises unsettled those who believed such achievements disrupted the natural hierarchy of the time. Economic envy quietly merged with racial fear, creating a volatile undercurrent that ran through the city. This tension was further intensified by the growing influence of white supremacist organizations, including the Ku Klux Klan, which gained significant traction across the United States during this period. These groups thrived on fear, presenting themselves as protectors of tradition while spreading narratives that blamed black advancement for social and economic instability. In Tulsa, their presence emboldened those who already viewed Greenwood with suspicion, reinforcing the idea that its success needed to be controlled or dismantled. What made Greenwood especially vulnerable was not just the resentment it provoked, but the lack of institutional protection surrounding it. While its residents contributed to the city's economy, they were excluded from political power and legal safeguards. Their prosperity existed in a fragile space, tolerated but not truly accepted. City leadership, law enforcement, and local media often reflected the same biases circulating among the broader white population, leaving Greenwood exposed when tensions reached a breaking point. By the early 1920s, the divide between Greenwood and the rest of Tulsa had become more than economic or geographic. It was psychological. Greenwood represented a future that contradicted deeply held beliefs about race, power, and belonging. For some, that future was unacceptable. The stage was set not because Greenwood had failed, but because it had succeeded too visibly, too confidently, and too independently in a society unprepared to accept what that success truly meant. Against the tense backdrop that had been quietly forming in Tulsa, the moment that ignited everything appeared, on the surface, all the eye. Almost ordinary. On May 30th, 1921, Dick Rowland, a 19-year-old black shoe shiner, entered an elevator in the Drexel building in downtown Tulsa. At the time, the building's upper floors had restrooms that black workers were permitted to use, making the elevator a routine part of Rowland's daily life. The elevator was operated by Sarah Page, a young white woman. What happened inside that small, enclosed space would soon be distorted far beyond recognition. Accounts of the encounter varied, and none were ever clearly proven. Some suggested that Rowland may have stumbled while stepping into the elevator and instinctively reached out to steady himself. Others believed he may have accidentally stepped on Page's foot, prompting her to cry out in surprise. Whatever occurred, Page herself later declined to press charges. Yet in a city already charged with racial anxiety and economic resentment, facts mattered far less than perception. Within hours, rumors began to circulate, fueled by deeply ingrained stereotypes that cast black men as inherent threats and white women as symbols needing protection. The following day, Rowland was arrested, not because evidence demanded it, but because the social climate made his guilt seem assumed. Sensationalized reporting transformed uncertainty into accusation, and the story quickly took on a life of its own. Headlines implied wrongdoing where none had been established, tapping into fears that had long been cultivated by segregation and racial propaganda. For many white residents already resentful of Greenwood's prosperity, the story became confirmation of beliefs they were prepared to accept without question. As news spread, crowds gathered outside the courthouse where Rowland was being held. The atmosphere grew volatile, charged not just by the incident itself, but by years of unresolved tension. Black residents, aware of the history of unjust punishments and the dangers of mob action, arrived armed, determined to protect Rowland from harm. Their presence, intended as a defense, was interpreted as a provocation by the growing white crowd. What might have remained a local misunderstanding instead became the spark that ignited a long simmering powder keg. In that moment, the narrative surrounding Dick Rowland shifted entirely. He ceased to be an individual and became a symbol, used to justify actions that had little to do with the truth of the elevator encounter. The incident provided a convenient excuse, a single story onto which fear, envy, and hostility could be projected. Greenwood's success, once admired from a distance, was now framed as a threat that needed to be confronted. What followed was not the result of a spontaneous outburst, but the consequence of a society primed to react violently when challenged. The accusation against Rowland did not create the hatred, it merely unlocked it. The structures that allowed rumors to outweigh facts, and prejudice to override justice, ensured that a minor and unresolved encounter could escalate into something catastrophic. In the hours that followed, Tulsa crossed a line from tension into tragedy, driven not by truth, but by the dangerous power of assumption and fear. As night fell over Tulsa, the tension that had been building for years finally spilled beyond control. What began as angry crowds quickly transformed into organized destruction, moving with a purpose that suggested preparation rather than chaos. Armed white groups poured toward Greenwood, crossing boundaries that had once seemed fixed, driven by fear, resentment, and the belief that they would face no consequences. The streets that had once echoed with music, conversation, and commerce were suddenly filled with panic and confusion as residents realized that their community was under coordinated attack. Local authorities, whose role should have been to restore order, failed to protect Greenwood's residents. In many cases, their actions or lack of theme only deepened the crisis. Instead of stopping the advancing mobs, law enforcement focused on disarming black residents who were attempting to defend their homes and families. This imbalance sent a clear message about whose safety mattered and whose did not. Greenwood, already isolated by segregation, now stood entirely exposed. As the violence escalated, entire blocks were set ablaze. Businesses that had taken decades to build were reduced to ruins in hours. Homes filled with family photographs, savings, and hard-earned stability disappeared behind smoke and fire. Churches, schools, and community center spaces that anchored Greenwood's social life were lost one by one. Witnesses later described the overwhelming sound of destruction, a relentless wave that moved from street to street with little resistance. Among the most disturbing accounts were reports of aircraft circling above Greenwood. According to survivors, these planes dropped incendiary materials, intensifying the destruction below. While official records would later minimize or deny this aspect, eyewitness testimonies remained consistent, passed down through generations as part of the community's collective memory. Whether acknowledged or not, these accounts reinforced the sense that Greenwood was not facing random violence, but a level of force rarely turned inward against a civilian neighborhood. By the time the National Guard arrived, the damage was already irreversible. Greenwood lay in ruins, its once vibrant streets transformed into charred remains. Survivors emerged from hiding to find their lives erased almost entirely. Yet even then, their suffering did not end. Thousands of black residents were rounded up and detained in makeshift camps under armed guard, prevented from returning to what little remained of their homes. They were held for days, sometimes weeks, forced to watch from a distance as the physical evidence of their lives disappeared. When the smoke finally cleared, the scale of the destruction became undeniable. More than 35 city blocks had been wiped out. Over 1,000 homes were gone. Entire family histories, businesses, and community institutions no longer existed. The loss of life was profound, though never fully accounted for. Official numbers drastically understated the reality, while survivors spoke of bodies left unrecorded and hurried burials that ensured many victims would never be named. What made the devastation even more painful was what did not happen afterward. There were no widespread arrests of those responsible, no meaningful efforts to provide immediate relief. Instead of accountability, Greenwood's residents were met with suspicion and blame. Their suffering was treated not as a tragedy demanding justice, but as an inconvenience to be managed and forgotten. This moment marked more than the destruction of buildings. It severed generational progress, erased accumulated wealth, and left deep emotional scars that would persist long after the fires went out. Greenwood had been built through determination and unity, and its destruction revealed how fragile success could be in a society unwilling to accept it. The violence of that night was not an isolated eruption, but the brutal outcome of years of tension finally unleashed, reshaping Tulsa forever and leaving a legacy that could not be buried, no matter how hard some tried to erase it. When the fires finally died down and the noise of destruction faded, Greenwood's survivors stepped into a silence that was almost as devastating as the violence itself. The streets they once knew were unrecognizable, covered in ash and debris, with familiar landmarks reduced to empty foundations. Families searched for relatives, neighbors, and any trace of the lives they had built, only to discover that the city offered no refuge, no reassurance, hint, and no intention of making things right. What followed was not healing, but abandonment. In the days and weeks after the massacre, survivors found themselves facing a system that seemed determined to erase both their losses and their voices. Those who had lost homes and businesses turned to insurance companies, believing that policies they had faithfully paid into would offer some form of recovery. Instead, claim after claim was rejected. Companies cited technical exclusions, labeling the destruction as unrest, rather than acknowledging the coordinated devastation that had occurred. With a single clause, decades of work, savings, and stability were written off, leaving families with nothing but ruins and unanswered questions. Legal protection was equally absent. Despite the scale of the destruction, there were no serious investigations into those responsible. No court proceedings offered survivors a chance to be heard. The absence of accountability sent a clear message. What happened in Greenwood was not considered a crime worth pursuing. City officials and local leaders shifted blame onto the very people who had suffered the greatest losses, portraying the community as responsible for its own destruction. This narrative not only deepened the injustice but also justified inaction. As time passed, the erasure became more deliberate. Official records disappeared, police reports were altered or destroyed, and public discussion of the massacre quietly faded from local discourse. Newspapers that had once fueled fear moved on without correction or reflection. Schools did not teach what had happened. Public institutions remained silent. Greenwood's story was pushed out of sight, replaced by a version of history that avoided discomfort and protected reputations. Among the most painful aspects of this silence was the fate of those who never returned home. Many victims were buried hastily, without markers or records, in places that would later be forgotten or deliberately concealed. Families were denied the chance to mourn properly, to name their dead, or to preserve their stories. These hidden graves became symbols of a deeper injustice, not only of lives lost, but of memories stolen. Why? Without acknowledgement, the loss remained suspended in uncertainty, passed down through whispers rather than recognized truth. For decades, survivors carried this burden alone. Some attempted to rebuild Greenwood with limited resources, facing zoning laws and policies that made recovery nearly impossible. Others left Tulsa altogether, seeking safety and opportunity elsewhere, but never fully escaping the weight of what had been taken from them. Their experiences lived on through personal stories shared behind closed doors, while the broader public remained largely unaware that such a community had ever existed. It was not until the late 20th century that cracks began to form in this wall of silence. Descendants of survivors, historians, and activists pushed for recognition, demanding that the truth be uncovered and recorded. Their efforts revealed how intentional the forgetting had been, and how deeply the injustice extended beyond the events of 1921. The loss was not only physical or economic, but historical, shaping generations who were denied acknowledgement of what they had endured. Greenwood's destruction did not end with fire. It continued through neglect, denial, and deliberate forgetting. The absence of justice became part of the story itself, demonstrating how easily a community's suffering can be erased when those in power choose silence over accountability. Yet even in that silence, memory endured, waiting for the moment when truth would finally be allowed back into the light. Decades after Greenwood was reduced to ashes and silence settled over its memory, the truth began to surface in ways that could no longer be ignored. In the late 20th century, survivors, descendants, historians, and community leaders pushed back against decades of denial, demanding answers that had been withheld for far too long. Their persistence led to renewed investigations that challenged the official narratives and forced the nation to confront what had truly happened in Tulsa in 1921. What these efforts revealed confirmed what Greenwood's people had always known. The loss of life had been severely underreported, and the destruction was far greater than history had been willing to admit. As investigations deepened, evidence emerged that pointed to mass gravesquiat, unmarked places where victims had been buried without names or ceremony. Advances in modern technology allowed researchers to search areas long rumored to hold these graves, turning whispered memories into documented proof. These discoveries did more than validate survivor testimony. They restored dignity to lives that had been erased from the record. Each finding served as a reminder that history does not disappear simply because it is ignored. With renewed attention came a broader reckoning. The Tulsa Race Massacre was no longer treated as an isolated incident, but as part of a larger pattern of racial injustice that shaped American cities, wealth, distribution, and opportunity. Greenwood's destruction became a symbol of how progress could be systematically dismantled, and how the consequences of that destruction could echo across generations. The loss was not only measured in lives and buildings, but in stolen futures, interrupted legacies, systems and generational wealth that was never allowed to take root. Yet within this painful history, Greenwood also came to represent resilience. Despite overwhelming loss and decades of silence, the memory of Black Wall Street endured through families who refused to forget. Descendants carried forward the stories, transforming grief into determination. Their efforts ensured that Greenwood would no longer be defined solely by its destruction, but by the strength it took to demand recognition after being denied justice for so long. Today, the legacy of the Tulsa Race Massacre continues to shape conversations about reparations and racial justice. Calls for accountability are not rooted in the past alone, but in the understanding that healing requires acknowledgement and meaningful action. Greenwood stands as a reminder that progress without protection is fragile, and that silence can be as damaging as violence itself. Remembering what happened is not about reopening wounds, but about ensuring that the lessons are not lost again. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story and to honor the lives and history of Greenwood. If you believe that stories like this matter, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us as we continue to uncover the histories that deserve to be remembered. Your support helps keep these voices alive and ensures that the truth is carried forward, not buried. The truth is carried forward.